The Galactic Council chamber had never been so quiet. Ambassador of the Empire shifted nervously on his crystalline perch, his four eyes darting between the holographic displays that painted a picture of absolute devastation. The numbers were impossible to ignore, yet every species represented in this ancient hall wished they could unsee what floated before them. 17 star systems, whispered Council Prime Ra, her voice barely audible through the translation matrix. Gone, not conquered, not occupied, simply gone. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Every being in the chamber knew what those words meant. The Devourers had returned after 10,000 years of blessed silence, and this time they had come in numbers that comprehension. Admiral of the Therian Dominant stood slowly, his massive frame casting shadows across the circular chamber. His people had fought the Devourers before, in the ancient wars that had nearly ended all sentient life in the galaxy. They had won, but at such a cost that entire civilizations had been reduced to myths and legends. The preliminary reports are confirmed, announced, his voice carrying the weight of doom. The Devourer swarms have consumed the Outer Rim territories completely, 3 billion souls gone in less than a solar rotation. Their appetite has grown beyond anything we faced in the old wars. A collective shudder ran through the assembled delegates. The Devourers were not merely conquerors or invaders. They were something far worse, a hive-minded swarm of biomechanical entities that consumed entire worlds, stripping them of all organic and metallic matter to fuel their endless reproduction. Planets left in their wake were nothing but hollow husks of rock, drifting lifeless through space. What of the Valyrian defense grid? Asked Representative, his tentacles writhing with anxiety. Surely the most advanced military force in the galaxy can. Destroyed, interrupted. The entire Third Fleet was overwhelmed in the nebula. Admiral Han sent one final transmission before his flagship was consumed. The Devourers have evolved. They adapt to our weapons in real time now. What took weeks to counter in the old wars now takes them mere minutes. The chamber erupted in panicked chittering, roars, and electronic harmonics as dozens of species gave voice to their terror. Council Prime Ra's crystalline form pulsed with urgent energy as she called for order, but the fear was too great, too primal to be contained by protocol. Silence, the voice that cut through the chaos was not Ra's, but that of Elder of the Archive Keepers. The ancient being rarely spoke in council, preferring to observe and record. When he did speak, the galaxy listened. There is a possibility, said, his voice carrying across 10 of accumulated wisdom. One option we have not discussed. Ambassador felt his heart skip in sequence. In all his years of diplomatic service, he had never heard that tone from an archive keeper. It was the voice of someone about to reveal a secret that should have stayed buried. The humans, continued, and the chamber fell into a silence so complete that the ambient hum of the station's life support systems seemed deafening. We could ask the humans for help. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Half the chamber erupted in bitter laughter, while the other half recoiled in horror at the suggestion. Ambassador found himself somewhere between the two reactions, his minds racing through the implications of such a desperate proposal. Humans, the terror of the outer spiral, the species that had appeared from nowhere 3 centuries ago and carved out their own domain through sheer, brutal efficiency. They were younger than most of the species present by hundreds of thousands of years, possessing technology that was crude by galactic standards, yet somehow they had become the one force in the galaxy that even the great empires feared to challenge. Have you lost your ancient mind, Archive Keeper? Admiral's voice was thick with disgust. Those creatures are barely more civilized than the Devourers themselves. They've been at war with someone or something continuously since they achieved. They're violent, unpredictable, and completely without honor. Without honor, perhaps, replied calmly, but undeniably effective. In 3 centuries, they have gone from a single world to controlling 47 star systems. They have never lost a war, Admiral, not one. Representative's tentacles writhed faster. Because they fight like animals, they ignore all civilized conventions of warfare. They use tactics that are unspeakable. No rational being fights the way humans do. Which is precisely why they might succeed where we have failed, said. His ancient eyes swept the chamber, taking in every expression of fear, disgust, and desperate hope. The Devourers adapt to rational tactics, to logical strategies, but human warfare is neither rational nor logical. It is chaos given form and purpose. Ambassador remembered the reports he had read about human conflicts. The Battle of VII, where human forces had deliberately crashed their own ships into enemy formations when their weapons failed. The Siege of New Geneva, where human defenders had held a position for 2 standard years against overwhelming odds, eating recycled atmosphere filters to survive when food ran out. The horror of the Cassiopeia incident, where human commander Sarah had detonated her ship's reactor core in the middle of an enemy fleet, taking 40 vessels with her. These were not the actions of a sane, civilized species. They were the actions of something far more dangerous, a species that simply refused to accept defeat under any circumstances. "You speak of asking for their help as if they would simply agree," said Prime Minister of the Collective. "The humans have no love for any of us. We have spent 3 centuries treating them like dangerous pets, keeping them contained in their corner of the galaxy. Why would they risk themselves for our sake?" His response chilled every being in the chamber to their core. "Because if the Devourers consume the rest of us, the humans will be alone in a galaxy full of hungry monsters. And even humans, for all their ferocity, cannot fight an enemy that has consumed the resources of 1,000 worlds." The truth of those words settled over the chamber like a heavy shroud. The Devourers did not negotiate, did not show mercy, and never stopped consuming. If they succeeded in their current campaign, they would indeed turn their attention to the human territories. And while humanity might put up a fierce fight, even they had their limits. Council Prime Ra's form pulsed with the slow rhythms of deep thought. The humans have never acknowledged the authority of this council. They have actively rejected every attempt at diplomatic contact. How would we even approach them? "Through their military command," Admiral said reluctantly. "It's the only authority structure they seem to respect. But I warn you all, dealing with humans is like grasping a plasma torch. You might get what you want, but you'll be by the experience." "Then we send a military delegation," Ra decided. "A small force, enough to show respect but not enough to be seen as a threat. Who among us has had any contact with human forces?" The silence stretched until Admiral spoke again, his voice heavy with old memories. "I have. During the Rigel border incident 15 years ago, my ship encountered a human patrol vessel in disputed space. They spared us when they had every advantage. Their captain even shared tactical information about a pirate fleet that was raiding both our territories." "Then you will lead the delegation," Ra said. "Take representatives from the major empires, make them understand what we face." Ambassador found his voice. "And if they refuse, if they decide to let the Devourers consume us and then fight them alone?" His ancient eyes fixed on him. "Then we die as we have lived, civilized, rational, and utterly unprepared for an enemy that cares nothing for our sophistication." The meeting continued for several more hours, but the real decision had been made. They would go to the humans, hat in hand, and beg for salvation from the species they had spent centuries fearing and despising. 3 days later, Admiral stood on the bridge of the diplomatic vessel Harmony's Edge, watching the scanners as they approached the boundary of human space. His crew was nervous. They all knew the stories about what happened to ships that entered human territory without permission. "Long-range sensors are detecting multiple contacts," reported his navigation officer. "At least 12 vessels moving to intercept." Nodded grimly. Human space was defended like a fortress, with patrol fleets constantly moving through their territory in unpredictable patterns. No one had ever successfully mapped their defensive networks because they changed them constantly, sometimes without any apparent logic. "Open a channel on all frequencies," he ordered. "Broadcast our diplomatic credentials and request permission to approach Earth." The response came back within minutes, and it was not what he expected. "Galactic Council Vessel Harmony's Edge, this is Captain of the UEN Destroyer Defiant. We've been expecting you." Felt a chill run down his spine. Expecting them? How could the humans possibly know about their mission? "Captain," replied carefully, "I am Admiral of the Therian Dominance, carrying a diplomatic delegation from the Galactic Council. We request an audience with your military command." There was a pause, then his voice returned with what sounded suspiciously like amusement. "Admiral, with respect, we know why you're here. The same reason anyone comes knocking when there's something scary in the dark. Follow my ship to Luna Station. The Admiral is waiting for you." As the Harmony's Edge fell into formation with the human escort vessels, couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far more dangerous than the Devourers themselves. The humans weren't just expecting them, they were ready. And in his centuries of military experience, Admiral had learned that a ready human was the most terrifying force in the galaxy. The Luna station loomed ahead, a massive structure that somehow managed to look both defensively solid and aggressively threatening. It was, realized, the perfect metaphor for humanity itself, functional, intimidating, and completely unlike anything else in the galaxy. As their shuttle descended toward the docking bay, Ambassador leaned close to. "Admiral, I must ask, when you encountered the humans before, what was your impression of them?" Was quiet for a long moment, remembering. They were professional, efficient, and absolutely without fear, but what struck me most was how they looked at us, not with hatred or even particular dislike. They looked at us the way a craftsman looks at a tool, assessing whether we might be useful for some purpose we couldn't even imagine. The shuttle touched down with a gentle bump, and through the viewports they could see the welcoming committee. Humans in military uniforms, standing at attention with weapons clearly visible but not directly threatening. It was, thought, another perfect metaphor. "We're ready for violence," the display said, "but we're choosing civility. For now." As they prepared to disembark, every being in the delegation was thinking the same thing. They were about to ask the monsters to fight the nightmare. And the most terrifying part was that they weren't sure which was worse. Admiral Sarah stood at the observation deck of Luna Station, watching the alien shuttle dock with practiced efficiency. She had been expecting this moment for weeks, ever since the intelligence reports started coming in about something stirring in the dark regions beyond the galactic rim. The Devourers, humans, had their own name for them, of course. They called them the Swarm, and they had been planning for this encounter for over a century. "Ma'am," said Lieutenant Commander Jackson, approaching with a data pad. "The delegation is aboard. Admiral of the Therian Dominance, Ambassador of the Empire, and representatives from 6 other major powers." They looked nervous. Allowed herself a small smile. "They should be. They're about to ask us to save them from something that's been eating its way across the galaxy for the past month. That would make anyone nervous." Jackson frowned slightly. "With respect, Admiral, how do we even know we can help? The intelligence reports suggest this enemy has consumed 17 star systems in less than 30 days. That's a pace of destruction beyond anything in recorded galactic history." Turned from the observation window, her gray eyes hard as steel. "Commander, what do you know about human military doctrine?" "Our core principle is adaptive asymmetry," Jackson replied without hesitation. "We identify enemy strengths and avoid them entirely, focusing instead on exploiting weaknesses they don't know they have." "Correct, and what's the greatest strength of a hive mind?" Jackson thought for a moment. "Unity of purpose, perfect coordination, no internal conflict or confusion." "Also correct. Now tell me, Commander, what happens when you apply a stimulus to a hive mind that it cannot categorize or adapt to?" The realization dawned on Jackson's face. It becomes paralyzed trying to process the impossible input. "Exactly," picked up her service cap and headed toward the door. "Come along, Commander. Let's go meet our guests and discuss the art of fighting an enemy that thinks it understands warfare." The conference room was a study in contrasts. On one side sat the alien delegation, beings who represented thousands of years of accumulated knowledge and sophisticated technology. Their equipment was elegant, their bearing refined, their very presence speaking to the achievements of ancient civilizations. On the other side sat 3 humans. Admiral had chosen her team carefully. Herself, representing strategic command. General Martinez, a stocky man whose scars and weathered face spoke of countless ground campaigns. And Dr. Elizabeth, whose cheerful smile and casual demeanor hid one of the most brilliant tactical minds in human space. "Beings, honored delegates," began, "let me start by saying that we are aware of your situation. Our long-range monitoring stations have been tracking the entity you call the Devourers for several weeks now." Ambassador shifted uncomfortably. "Admiral, we appreciate your directness, but we must know, are you willing to help us? The galaxy faces extinction if this enemy is not stopped." Leaned back in her chair, studying the assembled aliens with an expression that gave nothing away. "Before we discuss what we might be willing to do, I think it's important that you understand exactly what you're asking for." She gestured to Doctor, who stood and activated a holographic display. The image that appeared showed a detailed analysis of Devourer ship movements, attack patterns, and consumption rates. "Your enemy is indeed formidable," Doctor said, her voice carrying the enthusiasm of a professor discussing a particularly interesting problem. "Adaptive biomechanical technology, hive mind coordination, and an exponential reproduction rate that uses consumed matter as raw material. Quite elegant, really." Admiral's forearms twitched with agitation. "Elegant? Doctor, these creatures have murdered billions of sentient beings." "Oh, I'm not praising their methods," Doctor replied with a smile that somehow made her words more unsettling. "I'm praising their efficiency. See, when you're designing a counter-strategy, you have to appreciate what you're fighting against, and what we're fighting against is a perfect predator. Perfect, that is, for hunting civilized prey." General Martinez spoke for the first time, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Thing is, nobody's ever accused humans of being civilized." The aliens exchanged glances, and could see they were beginning to understand that this conversation was not going the way they had expected. "Let me explain something about human warfare," continued. "Every other species in this galaxy approaches conflict like a chess match. You analyze your enemy, you plan your moves, you execute strategies based on logical projections of outcome. It's sophisticated, intelligent, and predictable." She stood and began packing around the table, her movement making several of the aliens instinctively shift away from her. "Humans don't play chess," she said. "We flip the table, set it on fire, and hit our enemy with the burning pieces while screaming at the top of our lungs. It's not sophisticated. It's not intelligent. But it works because no matter how adaptive your enemy is, they can't adapt to pure chaos backed by absolute refusal to surrender." Ambassador's voice was barely a whisper. "What are you saying?" Doctor's smile grew wider. "We're saying that your perfect predator has never hunted anything like us. The Devourers adapt by analyzing patterns, learning from successes and failures, and optimizing their approach based on predictable enemy responses. But what happens when your enemy doesn't have patterns? What happens when their responses aren't just unpredictable but actively defy logic? You get something like the Battle of Wolf 359, General Martinez added helpfully. Enemy fleet had us outnumbered 5-1, superior firepower, better shields, the works. So our commander ordered the fleet to ram them at maximum velocity while broadcasting human music at full volume across all frequencies. The enemy spent so much processing power trying to understand why we were playing Ride of the Valkyries during a suicide attack that their coordination broke down," continued. "They couldn't adapt to a strategy that made no tactical sense whatsoever. We lost 60% of our ships, but we won the battle." The silence that followed was broken by Representative. That's insane." "Exactly," Doctor said cheerfully. "Completely, utterly insane. And that's why it worked. You see, the Devourers have consumed 17 star systems worth of civilized resistance. They've adapted to every rational response, every logical strategy, every sophisticated tactic your people could devise. But they've never faced an enemy that treats warfare like an art form dedicated to beautiful impossibility." Admiral leaned forward. "Are you saying you have a plan to fight them?" Sat back down, her expression growing serious. "We're saying we've had a plan to fight them for over a century. We've been watching the galactic rim for signs of their return ever since we found the archaeological evidence on 442b. The alien stared at her in shock. Ambassador found his voice first. "You knew about them." "We found the remains of a Devourer ship that had been damaged and drifted for," Doctor explained. "Reverse-engineered their technology, analyzed their tactical patterns from ancient battle sites, and spent the last 100 years preparing for their inevitable return." "Why didn't you warn us?" demanded. General Martinez snorted. "Would you have listened? You've spent 3 centuries treating us like dangerous barbarians who might bite if you got too close. When we tried to share intelligence about pirates in the neutral zones, your response was to increase patrols to make sure we weren't the real threat." Held up a hand to forestall any response. "That's irrelevant now. What matters is that we can help you, but there are conditions." "Name them," Ambassador said immediately. "First, when we move against the Devourers, we do it our way. No interference, no suggestions, no attempts to impose civilized rules of engagement. You stay out of our way and let us work." "Agreed," said without hesitation. "Second, after this is over, the galaxy's attitude toward humanity changes. We're not your attack dogs that you can safely ignore when the danger passes. We want formal diplomatic relations, trade agreements, and a seat on the Galactic Council. The Council has never admitted a species so young, Representative protested. The Council has never asked a species so young to save them from extinction, replied calmly. Terms are non-negotiable. Ambassador looked around the table at his fellow delegates, reading the desperate agreement in their eyes. Accepted. Excellent. Third condition, we choose our own targets and our own timeline. You don't get to demand that we save particular worlds or populations. We hit the swarm where it will do the most damage to their strategic position, not where it will look best on the galactic news feeds. Understood. Smiled, and for the first time, it was a warm expression rather than a predatory one. In that case, welcome to the strangest military alliance in galactic history. Doctor, please explain to our new friends what they've just signed up for. Doctor's holographic display shifted, showing human fleet movements and deployment patterns that made no logical sense whatsoever. Ships moving in spirals, attack vectors that curved through empty space, and tactical formations that seemed designed by someone who had never heard of military strategy. The beauty of fighting the Devourers, Doctor began, is that they expect their enemies to behave like enemies. They're prepared for desperate last stands, strategic retreats, flanking maneuvers, and siege warfare. They are not prepared for what we call aggressive friendship. I'm sorry, Admiral interrupted. Aggressive friendship. We're going to introduce ourselves to the swarm, General Martinez explained with a grin that was absolutely terrifying. We're going to share human culture with them. Music, literature, cuisine, entertainment. We're going to broadcast Earth's complete historical archives directly into their hive mind while we're shooting them. You see, continued, the Devourers process information collectively. Everything that happens to any part of the hive gets shared with the whole. So when we force-feed them 10,000 years of human creativity, philosophy, and artistic achievement all at once, their collective consciousness is going to have something very much like a nervous breakdown. Ambassador stared at the tactical display, trying to process what he was hearing. You're going to attack them with poetry. Poetry, music, movies, video games, literature, historical documentaries, and really excellent cooking shows, Doctor confirmed. Along with enough concentrated firepower to crack moons in half, of course, but the real weapon is the cultural assault. The Devourers have consumed 1,000 civilizations, said, standing again. They think they understand what intelligence and creativity look like, but they've never encountered a species that considers warfare itself to be an art form, whose greatest military victories are remembered for their sheer audacious impossibility rather than their tactical brilliance. She moved to the window, looking out at the stars where humanity's fleets were already beginning to move into position for the most insane military campaign in galactic history. In 72 hours, the first human expeditionary force will make contact with the Devourer advance elements in the Andromeda sector, she announced. Admiral, I suggest you and your fleets stay well back from the combat zone. Why asked? Turned back to face the room, and her smile was the expression of someone who had just realized that the impossible had become merely difficult. Because what we're about to do is going to redefine the very concept of warfare. And honestly, I'm not sure even we know what's going to happen when 10,000 years of human chaos meets a hive mind that thinks it understands everything. As the alien delegation prepared to leave, Doctor made one final observation that would haunt their dreams for years to come. You know what the really beautiful part is? She said. If this works, the Devourers won't just be defeated, they'll be fundamentally changed. They'll spend the rest of their existence trying to understand how something like humanity is even possible. They'll become philosophers instead of predators, consumed by questions that have no logical answers. And if it doesn't work? Ambassador asked quietly. General Martinez shrugged. Then we all die fighting the most gloriously impossible battle in the history of the universe. Either way, it's going to be interesting. As the alien shuttle departed Luna Station, Admiral stood at her observation window, watching the stars and thinking about the campaign to come. Somewhere out there in the dark, an ancient enemy was consuming worlds with methodical efficiency. Soon, they would encounter something they had never faced before, a species that had turned warfare itself into a form of creative expression. The galaxy was about to discover what happened when unstoppable force met absolutely unpredictable object. And Admiral Sarah found herself looking forward to finding out which was which. The first sign that something was wrong came from the Devourer scout ships in the Andromeda sector. They had been advancing in their typical pattern, a precise geometric formation that optimized their ability to strip mine entire solar systems. They had consumed 3 worlds in the past week alone, their numbers growing exponentially as they converted raw matter into new units. The local resistance had been minimal, a few desperate strikes by Therian defense forces that were absorbed and analyzed within hours. Then the humans arrived. Commander Form felt the disturbance ripple through the collective consciousness like a discordant note in a perfect symphony. The scout units were reporting something impossible, an enemy fleet that appeared to be broadcasting something on every frequency simultaneously while moving in patterns that all tactical logic. The Devourer hive mind processed the incoming data streams with the efficiency of 10 million years of evolution. Sensor readings, tactical analyses, energy signatures, all of it fed into the collective intelligence that had conquered 1,000 worlds. And then the music started. Lieutenant Sarah, Wrecker, Williams sat at the communications station aboard the UEN destroyer Defiant, watching her instruments with the kind of concentrated attention usually reserved for disarming explosives. Which, in a way, was exactly what she was doing. "Package 1 is broadcasting on all frequencies, Captain," she reported. "Requiem is now being force-fed directly into their hive mind at approximately 10,000 decibels." Captain nodded grimly. "Any response from the swarm?" "They've stopped advancing. Formation is—" "It's weird, sir. They're not retreating, but they're not moving forward either. It's like they're trying to figure out what the hell we're doing." "Perfect launch package 2. William's grin could have powered a small city. "Package 2 away? Ninth Symphony, accompanied by the complete works of Shakespeare, being transmitted at maximum intensity." 3 light minutes away, the Devourer ships had indeed stopped their advance. For the first time in their collective memory, the hive mind was experiencing something that could only be described as confusion. The enemy was attacking them with organized sound patterns that served no tactical purpose. Worse, the sounds were accompanied by complex data structures that appeared to be some form of symbolic communication. The hive mind attempted to analyze the patterns, searching for hidden weapons frequencies or coded instructions. Instead, they found beauty. Commander Form felt the collective consciousness recoil as though struck. The organized sounds were creating resonance patterns in their biological components that were entirely unprecedented. More disturbing, the symbolic communications were conveying concepts that had no reference point in Devourer experience. Love, loss, hope, sacrifice for abstract principles. The hive mind had encountered thousands of species across the galaxy. They understood hunger, fear, territorial aggression, reproductive drive, all the logical motivations that drove biological entities. But this enemy was broadcasting concepts that made no survival sense whatsoever. What tactical advantage could be gained from love? Aboard the human command ship Indomitable, Admiral Sarah watched the tactical display with the satisfaction of someone whose impossible plan was proceeding exactly as designed. "Admiral," reported Commander Jackson, "the Devourer advance has completely halted. They're not attacking, not retreating, just sitting there. Our cultural bombardment appears to be having the desired effect." "Excellent, Phase 1 is complete. Signal the fleet, initiate Phase 2. "Ma'am, with respect, are you sure about this? We're about to try something that's never been attempted in the history of warfare." Smile was the expression of someone who had discovered that the impossible was merely difficult. "Commander, 3 hours ago the galaxy was facing extinction. Now we're about to save it using, and really excellent Italian cooking. I'd say we've already entered uncharted territory." She activated the fleet communication system. "All ships, this is Admiral, you know the mission. You know what we're fighting for. In 60 seconds we're going to introduce the Devourers to the full spectrum of human achievement. Remember, we're not just fighting for survival, we're fighting to prove that chaos and creativity will always triumph over order and efficiency. Make it beautiful, make it impossible, make it human." The response from her fleet commanders was immediate and enthusiastic. had handpicked her officers for this mission, choosing the most creative and slightly unhinged tactical minds in the human military. They had spent months planning what they were calling Operation Cultural Exchange, and they were about to unleash it on an enemy that thought it understood warfare. Phase 2 initiated, Jackson reported. All ships are beginning the assault. What followed every principle of military strategy ever developed by any sentient species in the galaxy. The human fleet attacked in impossible formations while broadcasting the complete works of human art and literature directly into the devourer hive mind. Ships moved in spirals that formed geometric patterns that somehow resembled famous paintings when viewed from above. Attack runs were coordinated to create musical rhythms with their weapons' fire. Captain Maestro, aboard the cruiser Symphony, conducted her ship's weapons batteries like an orchestra, timing each shot to create harmonic resonance with the cultural bombardment. Her tactical display showed devourer ships not just under attack, but under assault by 10,000 years of accumulated human creativity. "Target acquired," reported her weapons officer. "Devourer bearing 27 Mark IV. "Fire when ready, mister," ordered. "Give them a taste of Chopin's Revolutionary with a side order of quantum torpedoes." The Symphony's guns spoke in perfect rhythm with the classical music being broadcast across all frequencies, each shot timed to accent the musical phrases. It was completely insane, tactically irrelevant, and absolutely devastating to an enemy that expected logical patterns. Commander Form felt the hive mind convulse as new input streams flooded their collective consciousness. The enemy was now broadcasting visual patterns alongside the audio assault, geometric arrangements that somehow conveyed meaning without logical structure. More disturbing, the weapon's fire was itself following non-random patterns that seemed designed for aesthetic rather than tactical effect. The collective intelligence attempted to analyze the attack sequences, searching for optimal countermeasures. Instead, they discovered mathematics rendered as music, scientific principles expressed as poetry, and tactical maneuvers designed to create beauty rather than maximum damage. For a hive mind that had optimized itself over millions of years for perfect efficiency, encountering an enemy that prioritized beauty over functionality was like experiencing a fundamental breakdown in the laws of physics. But it was the cooking shows that finally broke them. Dr. Elizabeth had insisted on including human culinary programming in the cultural package, arguing that food preparation was one of humanity's highest art forms. As the battle raged, the complete archives of Earth's cooking shows were being force-fed into the devourer collective consciousness at maximum intensity. Julia Child explaining the proper technique for preparing vin, passionate discourse on the perfect risotto, philosophical meditations on food as cultural expression, all of it streaming directly into minds that had never encountered the concept of preparing food for anything other than basic nutritional consumption. The hive mind tried to process the idea of combining ingredients not for optimal nutrition, but for aesthetic and emotional satisfaction. They attempted to understand why these beings would spend hours preparing food that could be consumed in minutes. They struggled with the concept of cuisine as cultural identity, as artistic expression, as love made tangible. And in that struggle, something unprecedented happened in the collective consciousness of the devourers. They experienced doubt. For the first time in their evolutionary history, the hive mind began to question whether their perfectly efficient approach to existence might be missing something important. If these strange enemies could find meaning in the preparation of food, what other concepts existed that the devourers had never considered? The doubt spread through the collective like a virus, creating feedback loops that disrupted their coordination. Ships began moving in hesitant patterns, unsure whether to advance, retreat, or simply observe this impossible enemy that treated warfare like performance art. Admiral watched the tactical display with growing satisfaction as the devourer formation began to dissolve into chaos. "Admiral," Jackson reported, his voice filled with amazement, "the enemy fleet is. They're not attacking anymore. Half of them have stopped moving entirely, and the other half appear to be moving randomly." "What's their hive mind traffic looking like?" "According to Doctor's analysis, they're experiencing the equivalent of a philosophical crisis. The cultural bombardment has introduced concepts they can't process within their existing framework. They're trying to understand why we would create art, music, and cuisine that serves no survival function. Nodded. Perfect. Signal the fleet. Initiate Phase 3. Ma'am, Phase 3 is completely insane. Yes, that's rather the point, Commander. Phase 3 of Operation Cultural Exchange was the culmination of everything humanity had learned about asymmetric warfare. Instead of destroying the Devourer ships, the human fleet began attempting to communicate with them. Not through traditional diplomatic channels or logical argument, but through the universal language of shared experience. Captain James, poet, of the destroyer Whitman began broadcasting his ship's library of human poetry directly to individual Devourer vessels, personalizing each transmission. For the ships that seemed contemplative, Whitman for those that appeared to be struggling with concepts of individuality, Robert Frost for the ones that had stopped moving entirely. Devourer Ship Designation 77 Alpha, announced over the communication array. This is Captain of the Earth vessel Whitman. I'd like to share something with you. What followed was personal reading of Maya, Still I Rise, transmitted directly into the hive mind's processing centers. The effect was immediate and profound. Designation 77 Alpha, that had participated in the consumption of 3 civilizations, found its collective consciousness focused entirely on attempting to understand the concept of rising above adversity through strength of will rather than superior firepower. Other human ships began similar communications. Captain Maria Santos of the cruiser shared the complete works of, while Commander David of the destroyer Soul broadcasted Korean poetry translated into mathematical equations that created visual patterns in the Devourer ship's sensor arrays. What the humans were doing was unprecedented in the history of galactic warfare. They weren't trying to defeat the enemy. They were trying to change them fundamentally, to introduce concepts that would make the very idea of consumption-based existence seem limited and incomplete. And it was working. Commander Form felt the collective consciousness fragmenting as individual ship nodes began developing what could only be described as personalities. Ships that had spent eons as identical components of the hive mind were suddenly experiencing individual responses to the human cultural transmissions. Some found themselves fascinated by the mathematical beauty of music. Others became absorbed in the visual patterns of human art. A few began attempting to understand the complex emotional relationships described in human literature. For the first time in their evolutionary history, Devourer ships began making individual decisions rather than following collective directives. The transformation accelerated when Captain of the Symphony made an unprecedented offer. "Attention, Devourer fleet," she broadcast on all frequencies. "I am Captain of the human vessel Symphony. We know you understand our language by now. You've been analyzing our communications for hours. I want to make you an offer." The response came back in perfectly synthesized human speech, transmitted from dozens of Devourer ships simultaneously. "We are listening, human. We'll stop shooting at you if you'll stop eating people. It's that simple." The silence that followed was deafening. Across the galaxy, monitoring stations from 100 species recorded the moment that an unstoppable force encountered something it had never considered possible, an enemy that offered friendship instead of destruction. Why? The question came from the hive mind, but could hear individual voices within it, ship consciousnesses that were learning to think independently. Its answer would be remembered in galactic history, alongside the greatest diplomatic achievements of any civilization. Because you don't have to be what you were made to be, we've shown you that there are ways of existing that you never imagined. Music that serves no tactical purpose but creates beauty. Stories that convey truth through fiction. Food that brings people together instead of simply fueling survival. You could be more than just consumers. You could be creators. What happened next was completely unprecedented. One by one, the Devourer ships began powering down their weapons. Admiral felt a mixture of triumph and disbelief as her tactical officers reported what their sensors were showing. "Admiral, the entire enemy fleet has ceased hostile actions. They're requesting permission to approach our ships. They want to learn more about human culture." Activated the fleet communication system. "All ships, stand down from combat alert but maintain defensive positions. This is either the greatest victory in human history or the most elaborate trap ever conceived." Either way, we're about to find out what happens when a hive mind discovers free will. 6 months later, Admiral stood in the observation deck of Luna Station, watching something that no one in the galaxy had thought possible. In the space around Earth, Devourer moved in careful formations alongside human vessels. But they were no longer the efficient, identical units that had once consumed worlds. Each ship had developed its own personality, its own interests, its own approach to existence. Some had become artists, using their biomechanical nature to create sculptures and music that no purely organic or mechanical species could achieve. Others had become philosophers, contemplating the nature of consciousness and creativity. A few had become teachers, sharing their vast knowledge of the galaxy with human scientists. Ambassador approached the observation window, his expression still showing the wonder of someone whose entire worldview had been fundamentally altered. "Admiral," he said, "I must ask, did you know this would happen? When you planned Operation Cultural Exchange, did you know you would convert the Devourers rather than destroy them?" Smiled, watching as a former Devourer ship performed what could only be described as a ballet with 3 human destroyers, their movements perfectly synchronized to a piece of music they had composed together. "Ambassador, the beauty of human warfare is that we never really know what's going to happen. We just make sure that whatever happens is completely impossible for our enemy to predict or counter." She turned from the window, her expression growing more serious. "But I will say this, we didn't save the galaxy by being stronger than the Devourers or smarter or more advanced. We saved it by being more human than they could understand. In the end, that was enough." As the two beings watched the former enemies dancing among the stars, Ambassador reflected on the fact that the galaxy had indeed been saved by asking the monsters to fight the nightmare. The terrifying truth was that humanity hadn't defeated the nightmare at all. They had convinced it to become something better. And in doing so, they had proven that sometimes the most powerful weapon in the universe wasn't superior technology or overwhelming force, but the simple refusal to accept that things had to stay the way they were. The Devourers still existed, but they were no longer Devourers. They had become something entirely new, something that chose creation over consumption, beauty over efficiency, and individual thought over collective certainty. It was, thought as she watched the impossible ballet continuing outside her window, the most human victory possible. They had won not by destroying their enemy, but by making them part of the family. Even if it was the strangest family in the galaxy.